This is TWiT.
I'm curious about the learning curve. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I wondered if you could go into a little bit more. Specifically, as a developer who's maybe used to a different language, not necessarily as a complete beginner, but what are the major hurdles that I'm going to face getting up to speed, and is there anything that you could say to give words of encouragement to get over them?
Sure. Don't be afraid. No, I'm kidding. Basically, that's a question we actually get a lot, and I think that's also a concern that many developers have. That is actually actually learning Wasp is very easy because you're not really learning a language. It's not a complex language. It's a very simple language, not complex at all, like JavaScript or any other general Turing complete programming language. So it's more like JSON. It's kind of like JSON, which has some web app specific things. So it's actually super simple, and that's mostly it, because you're still writing most of your. So like if you need to write some kind of business logic, like some kind of function that takes some inputs and outputs and so on, you're still doing that in JavaScript. So you're still sticking to your favorite language, which you know. And while developing a Wasp app, I think you will be spending probably like 80% or 90% of your time in your language of choice, like JavaScript. Only about 10% or so will be spent in Wasp, and that will not be the easier part. So yeah, it's really easy. It's really easy to learn.
So I have a question. That the only language I learned anything of actually was JavaScript, and it was in a journalism class. Cool. A few years ago, because there's a realization in graduate school journalism that an awful lot of what one would be covering was data and had to do with data, and especially if you're taking in data from multiple places and you're trying to integrate it, and like there was a project where there were some public forms of data that were available, and the students were asked to do some things with it and turn it into a story or something like that. It struck me that JavaScript wasn't that hard to learn, at least at a certain basic level. But what I'm thinking with Wasp is it the kind of thing that would be taught in a class, like, even if it's not a computer science class, say if somebody already is in a discipline where they need to know some JavaScript, and it could be taught in a school.
To be honest, I actually think Wasp is so simple that it shouldn't be taught in school. I think it's actually too simple. Wasp is more like a tool that you just pick up on the side to get things done. It's harder. You said JavaScript wasn't so hard to learn, right? Which makes sense. Maybe depends on the person, but I think there is a huge gap in person learning the basics of language and then being able to actually make a web app. It's a huge gap, because there is so much more than just learning a language. You actually need to learn like 5 languages: HTML, CSS, maybe just JavaScript if you're lucky, if there is nothing else on the backend. But it's much more. It's about all the concepts, about what is API, what kind of messages are being sent, how to implement something like authentication, what is even a page, how does page behave, should a certain piece of logic be performing on the server or in the browser. So there is so many things that are beyond just learning a language, and I think those are the hardest parts after you learn the language, and those are also the parts that Wasp tries to kind of remove, and at least remove as much as possible. So all those industry specific parts. By the way, it's interesting that you were learning JavaScript. I would probably assume Python would be cool for data. Although, by the way, my JavaScript for me is also a language of choice recently for all the smaller jobs, because it's just so ubiquitous. It's both on front end, on back end. It's just everywhere. So